very interesting time that you're here now in Brussels. I'm a journalist myself, I must put that first. And I've been following events in Brussels related to Russia, to Ukraine. There is a lot going on right now. It's a very interesting decision because they haven't been announced precisely, but they're subject to change. Yesterday from the Council of the European Union. We are also yesterday there was a decision by the Parliament, European Parliament, external association agreement and other things, which is very early into the year for the European Parliament to make any such important meetings. You know that the European Union is going to have a new head of foreign relations. We are from this meeting, European Union. So, I think that during the visit there will be many who wish to meet you, and she's looking for a time in her agenda to meet you. So it's a newer draft than the one that you have. Is already so that you can meet as many interesting people as possible.
Excuse me, so the meeting with the
working for the project. She will be with us also most of the time, and she will make the introductory presentations in.
So, I want to start with the following statement, which is very important, so that you have a starting point of understanding how it's done here. First, you have to know that in the European Union, everything is defined according to a policy area. And it means that you have to know which are the policy areas that are exclusive competence of the European Union, which are the policy areas that are exclusive competence of the national states, the member states, and which are those that fall in between, where more or less some of the components are decided at EU level, some others at national level. What does that mean? There is a limited number of policies, they are listed in the treaties, in which the member states have given exclusive competence to the EU level to decide. And then the decision-making takes place here in Brussels. Still, there are policies that remain exclusive national competence. For example, the trade policy is a policy area where EU decides. Why? Because the European Union has started its existence as a market. This was the primary aim of this entity, to have a single united market. So when it comes to trade, the member states have given the European level, which is the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, we will go there in a while, the right to decide. So the member states cannot take decisions on their own. It's the EU level that decides. However, when it comes to education, social policies, for example, there are still national policies and the competence of the national states, which means that even if you are a citizen of a member state and you have a problem with your educational system or the way it functions, even if you go to the Commission and say, you know, I want it to be different, the Commission will say, I cannot do anything because we don't have the competence to do that. Go to your national government, complain there, use your mechanism for influencing and changing the status quo and so on and so forth. So now I will go very quickly through the decision-making process and how it's done within those competencies that are exclusive competencies of the EU. Not the national ones, because the national decision-making is different in each member state, but the European one. And then we will talk a bit about the foreign policy, because the foreign policy falls within those kind of policies that are mixed. There you have 4 components, 2 of which are decided at EU level, 2 of which are still exclusively competence of the national states. So it's even more complicated. Let's first look at those policies like, for example, trade, where the decisions are taken exclusively at the EU level. So, there are mainly three institutions that are involved in the decision-making process at EU level. This is the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of the EU. Now, one very important distinction. What is the Council of the EU and how does it differ from the European Council? The Council of the EU is the body that participates in the decision-making process at EU level, and it is comprised of ministers of the member states, ministers of member states depending on the thematic area. If you decide in agriculture, those will be the ministers that deal with agriculture from the national level. If you decide on trade, it will be the economic ministers. Yeah? If you decide on foreign policy, it will be the foreign policies ministers. Yeah? The Foreign Council is this format of the council that is comprised of the foreign ministers. They take decisions together with the Parliament and the Commission. We will see how. It's a different thing from the European Council. The European Council is comprised of the head of states, yeah? the highest political level. It could be the presidents, it could be the prime ministers, depending on what kind of democracy you have, whether it's parliamentary or presidential. And those guys, the European Council, they give strategic decisions. They are the political body of the European Union, but they do not participate on a daily basis in the decision-making process. It's the Council of Ministers. So, another difference from the national level. There is only one institution at European level that has the right to suggest and to initiate legislation. Can you guess which institution is this? Whether this is the Commission, whether this is the European Parliament, or the Council of Ministers. Other suggestions? Actually, it's the European Commission. So, the European Commission is the only institution who has the right of legislative initiative at EU level. The European Parliament and the Council can invite the Commission to legislate, but it's up to the Commission to decide whether to do it or not, depending on whether she will decide that there is that she has a competence to do so, and whether and depending on the decision of the political situation. So the Council and the Parliament can ask the Commission to do so, but it's only the Commission that can initiate legislation. The Commission initiates the legislation, and then the legislation is co-decided by the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. Here is the chart that illustrates this process. You know that we have 28 member states, which hasn't been changed here. So the Commission initiates and proposes legislation, the Council and the Parliament jointly decide on the legislation. They do that in different formats and modus operandi depending on the thematic area. But more or less this is the scheme. Very, very different from the national level where the European Parliament usually has the legislative initiative. Because I come from a civil society organization, I want to tell you also something interesting that may be of interest for those of you who also reach out to citizens and reflect their opinion on the matters. After the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, we have a new, very interesting animal here at Europe called European Citizens Initiative. This is a new instrument for participatory democracy. According to which, if 1 million European citizens from at least 7 member states managed to collect 1 million signatures within a time frame of 12 months on a certain subject, they can invite the Commission, as can the Council as well as the Parliament, to start a legislation on this topic or to amend the legislation. So for the first time in the history of the European Union, this kind of right has been given to European citizens, and not only to the European institutions. So far, because this instrument has been living for 2 years now, there are a lot of problems, of course, with its implementation in practice, because, as you can imagine, it's easier said than done to collect 1 million signatures for 12 months from all over Europe. But generally, there have been about 40-something initiatives initiated. 3 of them have managed to collect 1 million signatures already. And the practice there is quite interesting. One of them, water as a human right, this is how it's called, which actually was against the privatization of water in the member states, managed to convince the Commissioner on Competition to take the water out of the concession directive that has been drafted. By that time. Some of the initiatives, I have to admit, are totally crazy in terms of subjects as well, but this is how democracy works. Yeah? We are following those developments because my organization is managing a support center for organizers of citizens' initiatives. So we have analysis of what's going on, and it's quite interesting as an experiment. But this is on a different subject. Just wanted to tell you that there is such a thing that exists here as well. So when it comes to the EU level, the Commission proposes the legislation and it's co-decided by the Council and the Parliament. Once the legislation is effect, it goes back to the Commission as a responsibility to monitor the enforcement of this legislation. Which means that in case some of the member states do not act accordingly, do not apply the legislation as it has been adopted, or just delaying putting the institutions that has to implement it in time, then each and every citizen of the European Union and everyone interested can complain to the European Commission about that. The Commission starts investigation, which, in the worst-case scenario, can end up with infringement procedure against the member state. And if the member state does not correct it, then even with financial sanctions. So this is with regard to the exclusive competences and policy areas of the European Union. As I already mentioned, EU foreign policy is a mixed policy area. We have there 2 areas, the common foreign and security policy and the common security and defense policy, that are still national competencies, and where the whole interaction among the member states could be and goes only along the intergovernmental cooperation. Those aspects that relate to economic trade, of course, are EU level competence, community policy, which means that there the decision making goes along this triangle that I just explained. And the same is valid for European development and cooperation. Which is the policy along which we have all the developments that are going on in the neighborhood policy, Eastern and South neighborhood. This project is also possible because of this policy. What happened after the Treaty of Lisbon? There has been a very consistent efforts to strengthen the international role of the European Union. Mainly because of the fact that it's not a pure community policy, it's not a new policy, but it still depends on the willingness and cooperation and consensus building among 28 member states. That's why the European Union said, okay, we need to strengthen it. We need to facilitate it and to come up with something which produces a more consistent results. That's how they decided to establish the External Action Service, the European External Action Service, which is called the Foreign Ministry of the European Union. You will hear this as a popular term. It's a new institution, already 5 years in existence after the Lisbon Treaty, headed by the High Representative of the Union, with the main function to facilitate the coordination among the member states. Very important thing. What they do is facilitation of the decision-making process among the member states. Because it's not a new policy, legislation is not taking place at EU level with regard to the foreign policy. What is done is the adoption only of decisions based on consensus among all 28 member states, which means classical intergovernmental approach within those areas. Those are the decisions. Member states decide. The High Representative is facilitating the process, coordinating it with also all the institutions. But the High Representative and the External Action Service do not have a mandate to act on their own. They cannot take decisions themselves. They can only play a facilitating role and a supporting role in terms of research and everything. And once the decisions are taken by the member states, based on consensus, they are responsible for their implementation. This is why in these policy areas, with regard to the foreign policy and the security policy and the defense policy, you will not see the classical way of decision-making where the European Commission suggests, but the Council and the Parliament co-decides, just because this is not a new area. It's member states' area. That's why you don't have legislation, you have only decisions. And those decisions are taken not by the EU institutions, but by the member states. This is why it's so slow. It takes so long. It's so complicated. Because if one member state says, no, we are not happy with this, there is no decision. This is what happens more or less under the common foreign and security policy. The European Council defines the principles. The Council of Ministers adopts the decisions. Council of Ministers in the format of the foreign ministers. Decisions are taken by consensus, and all the negotiations, the preparatory work, and the post factum work is done by the European External Action Service. Same with the security and defense policy. I'm sure you know that more or less the European Union is still playing soft power there, because the military capacity and the hard power is in the hands of the member states. Most of them are members of NATO, and this is how they enacted. So the European Union is still not a decisive player in this field, it's the member states. It's a different thing with the commercial policy. Commercial policy is a new policy, has always been. So there is the European Commission that negotiates with third countries. Therefore, everything which relates trade agreements goes through this mechanism that we saw: European Commission, Parliament, Council, because it's a new policy. The same with European Development and Cooperation. It's a DG, which means Directorate General within the European Commission. This is how the European Commission functions. It has departments called Directorate Generals that deal with different topics. The overall purpose of the EuropeAid is to formulate EU development policy, to help reduce poverty in development countries, and to promote through these basic values like sustainable development, democracy, peace, security. Who is who, I guess you know already, although it's never easy to remember and to understand. But the Foreign Affairs Council, this is this format of the Council of Ministers, which comprises of the foreign ministers of the member states. They meet more or less once a month. They are chaired by the High Representative. And they take decisions by consensus. It has at present about 3,000 employees. It's an interesting mixture there, because when it was created, it was decided that they will take 1/3 of the employees from the former services of the European Commission dealing with external policy. So those were the bureaucrats that were moved. Then they took 1/3 of the council, and 1/3 are seconded candidates, which are diplomats from the member states. And you meet some of them and you see that those are the most interesting people, actually, that are very experienced, with a really understanding of what foreign policy means also for the member states, because I can tell you that if you are in a member state, it's very possible that some of the things will look quite different than if you're here in Brussels. You know all this talk about the Brussels bubble? If you spend here enough time, there is a risk of losing, the touch with reality a bit. So this is why it's very important to have this view from the member states, and how what is happening here is seen and what kind of implication it has at the national level. So it's a very interesting mixture. You will meet, I think, quite an interesting people there today. It has an independent budget. It works through geographical departments and thematic departments. And since it has been created, also the former Commission's representations in abroad have been moved under the authority of the External Action Service. And now they are called EU embassies. A little bit about the European Parliament. This is the new picture after the elections in 2014. Actually, the first three groups haven't changed their places. There has been a bit of a shift in the number of places that they have, the number of MEPs, but the picture has been the same before as well, with the European People's Party leading, followed by the group of Progressive Alliance of the Socialists and the Democrats and the European Conservatives. The European Parliament is just starting to function now. Before that, they have been in a process of forming of political groups. Maybe you have heard also about all those fears that, you know, now there are a lot of Eurosceptics there. They have been counted to be close to 100 out of the 500 and something members of the European Parliament. Most of them actually didn't manage to form groups together, because apparently the Eurosceptics in France do not like the Eurosceptics in the UK and so on. So it's not only enough to be a Eurosceptic in order to come together. So they're divided along their external lines as well.
So do I understand correctly, there are majority of Eurosceptics, but they do not manage to form any...
No, they're not majority. They're more than before. Close to 100, but in other, because some of them are independent. They entered as independent, some others entered through, because, you know, you go through the political parties at national level. And then once you're elected, you have to become part of the so-called European political families. So if you're a newcomer, a new monster, and you cannot find your place in the well-established groups, because, for example, EPP will not want to accept Eurosceptics or the others, then you have two possibilities. Either to be an independent, which doesn't give you much leverage, yes, or to form a group. In order to form a group, there have to be 25 members coming together along certain political lines. And it's good to form a group because in that way you immediately have access to a budget. If you have a group, you have a budget. If you have a budget, you can do more things. Yeah?
Okay, and 25 members is a minimum you have to get.
Yes. If you do not gather 25 members, you don't have a group. So this is what happened actually, that they didn't manage to get 25 because they were, yeah.
Sorry, one more question as regards those Eurosceptics. Are they professional or are they more populistic?
Well, coming as a not-for-profit organization, I think I can share my opinion about that. You have all kinds of animals in the European Parliament. It's not only the Eurosceptics that are populists, if I can put it like this. You have to understand one thing that, and it's not, I mean, what I will say is not very politically correct. Because of the fact that the European Parliament does not have the role that the national parliaments have, this is why some of the member states do nominate and send to the European Parliament politicians that they do not want to have at national level.
Is this possible to nominate? I thought they
Nominate and then elected. But it goes through the national political parties. So you can see all kinds of interesting performances, let's say, in the European Parliament. They state to be, you know, more the most democratic body because it's directly elected. But what is also important is that, and they speak quite freely, and this you will also see, in comparison, for example, with the External Action Service or with the European Commission. But I want you to bear in mind also the level of responsibilities that they have. Maybe this kind of a more free talk is also related to the fact that they do not have a decisive place as some others in the decision-making process. Take this not as an official position, but as an opinion of somebody who is running a citizens' organization, okay? Yeah. It's different. I mean, it's different. For example, for my country, I'm Bulgarian, and for the new member states, it's still a very prestigious thing to become an European MEP. For Western Europe, not really. So,
There was one more question.
yes.
Часто говорится о том, что в числе Европарламента есть большая пророссийская группа, это депутаты из стран Восточной Европы, и которые, как правило, поддерживают инициативы России, вопреки мнению большинства членов Европарламента. Вот эти депутаты, они, как правило, внефракционные, не принадлежат ни к одной группе, либо они каким-то из них принадлежат другим группам, вот по большинству из них.
No, yeah, не знаю. I don't. I mean, which are those MEPs? Do you know? I mean, is there a fraction like this, or is it a group?
Ну, как правило, считается, что есть группа депутатов, ну, например, и представители русского населения прибалтийских стран, которые традиционно поддерживают любые инициативы.
This is very possible. Yes, of course. As the opposite is also true. Yeah. There are a lot of MEPs from especially the Baltic countries that are very much anti-Russia. So you have all this. It's normal because they're elected, they're representatives, so they have different views, and they, in a way, defend those views. But the question is what kind of leverage this can have on the official policies of the European Union. I'm telling you again that this official policy with regard to Ukraine, it depends on the member states because it's decided there. So the European Parliament can raise questions, they can do studies, they can initiate hearings, but they cannot decide on that. Otherwise, it's normal. It's very normal. We have all different voices.
Вообще уточнить вот этот вопрос. Существует ли вообще вот эта вот группа, которая поддерживает позицию России? Потому что российские СМИ постоянно говорят, что там Европарламент активно там выступил, хотя там на самом деле несколько человек что-то сказал. Вообще есть какая-то, вот вы как человек, который занимаетесь изучением этого органа, там есть какая-то группа, которая настроена явно пророссийски, или это просто позиция отдельных депутатов, которые ситуационно собираются вместе?
I think that your second option is the right option. But of course, this is a conversation that you have in the European Parliament, and you can ask them directly. And yeah, we are going there, so you'll be able to. But I think even there are, I mean, certain coalitions, they do not make a difference because the European Union has a very, very strictly defined policy, I think, with regard to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. I mean, it may not be the sharpest possible policy because of what we discussed, the consensus and the need to reach a consensus among 28 member states, but I think there isn't any doubt about the European policy, the official European policy towards the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Okay, so the role of the European Parliament. Although it has more and more competencies after the Lisbon Treaty, which means that because the role of the European Parliament traditionally goes two ways, depending on the policy that is decided. It can either contribute to the content of the policy, so once the Commission initiates the legislative act, it's sent to the Council of Ministers and to the Parliament. So, depending on the area, the Parliament can do two things. Either say yes or no, or contribute to the content of the policy, which means provide also comments and, in a way, have an input on what is decided. Now, the European Parliament is trying, after the Lisbon Treaty, to extend its role, and even in those cases where it has only the right to say yes or no, what they play is a very interesting political game. If they decide that they want to influence the content, they say no, and then this gives them leverage to start negotiations behind the doors, and also provide them with the opportunity to have an input on the content. So this we have seen on a number of occasions. They play this very successfully through the budget because they have the right to veto the budget. So maybe, I don't know whether you know, but actually because the European Union budget is decided every 7 years, and now we just started the new financial period, which is 2014-2020. 14, the beginning of 2014, January 2014, 2020 is the new financial. So we are now in the beginning of the new financial period, and because of the veto of the European Parliament, all the negotiations took much longer than initially envisaged, and the European Union was late with the adoption of the budget, and that's why most of the programs were delayed also this year. So there is also a very interesting dynamic here among the three institutions with, political fights, who will be dominating, who will say more, and so on and so forth. But more or less, the European Parliament, yes, it decides on the budget, and it's an important leverage. A little bit, couple of words about the European neighborhood policy, because this is something which is important for you, although I know that you know it. It's developed in 2004. The idea is to bring the European Union closer to its neighbors. It covers the eastern neighborhood as well as the southern neighborhood. It's a bilateral policy between the EU and each individual countries. There are 16 of them so far. You see them here. More or less, this policy very much resembles the enlargement policy in terms of how it works and the components it has in place. There is only one difference, that you don't have the promise of membership at the end of the road. But otherwise, there are bilateral action plans that are concluded between the European Commission and each of those countries. Those action plans are based on an agreement that are signed in advance, partnership and cooperation agreements or association agreements. So first you sign the agreement, then you come up with an action plan. The action plan, more or less, is like a shopping list of reforms. that both the EU and the country in question decide to implement. And then what happens is that there is a constant monitoring of how the country advances in the implementation of those reforms, and the European Commission issues annual progress reports on the advancement. And of course, and more or less, the priorities are those: democracy, human rights, rule of law, good governance, market economy, sustainable development. There is also a financial instrument that EU is putting into place in order to support the implementation of those reforms. And this is the European Neighbourhood and Partnership Instrument. This is how it's called. This is the new financial framework, 2014-2020, about 15 billion. You can see here the figure for the 2014 budget and how much is dedicated to the Eastern Partnership countries, part of which is also Ukraine. I think that now, because we will have a representative from Europaid, here they will be able to provide you with more concrete information and figures about the concrete programs for Ukraine. That you have access to, so this will be also there. Everything that is happening, you'll have access to it.
Yes, all the
Yeah.
present.